The first word that comes to mind when I think about becoming home is peace. I think becoming home yourself or inside yourself, it's one of the few ways left to not be at war. I understand it's very personal. Nothing is more political than the personal. And this idea of permanent ubiquity, it's not going to be an exception any longer. It's going to be a feature. It's going to be what the system is defined by, what the product of the system is defined by. And becoming home is why we're here. There's no other way for me to describe that. And not just because it's archetypically the end of every story, right? It's because it gives meaning to why we're traversing this planet. And it gives me that feeling that sometimes it's an illusion and sometimes it's something that I feel very deeply of being at peace.
I'm Ranjor, and this is Remake, a podcast about design, systems, and society. In each episode, I talk to someone who's trying to change our lives for the better in some meaningful way, whether through a new product, new venture, or a new way of looking at the world. And I try to understand how they came to it, what makes them tick, and what we can learn from them. Donatella Caggiano is a global creativity hacker. With her methodology crossing design, storytelling, and strategy, she works at applying creativity to processes of change and transformation for brands, communities, and people. She made a crucial decision to leave the high-powered business world of corporate America in midlife, return to her home country of Italy, and to do so intentionally and mindfully. Her new podcast in the making, The Design of Return, deals with personal stories of transit as told by the in-betweeners. In this conversation, we discuss Donatella's journey away from and back into home, the differences between the design of different places, the inhuman design of places like Orange County, California, what makes a skillful return, experiencing culture shock in your own culture, and finding a home within yourself. So let's jump right in with Donatella Caggiano. So Donatella, welcome to Remake Podcast.
Thank you, Heron. Thank you for having me.
Your story in many ways is a story of an awakening, a transition. And so when I start a podcast, I usually start with a question what's something that you've believed since childhood that is still with you, that still drives you today throughout all of these changes? Something you discovered or learned early in life?
First of all, thank you for this question because, as you mentioned, in a moment of huge transition and awakening, you spend way more time in your childhood than in your adulthood, actually. I have to say, if I have to think about one belief that I grew up with as a kid that I'm carrying with myself right now, is probably that home is wherever you are. I think this comes from the fact that when I was 7 years old, I left my hometown, which is a small village in the south of Italy called Buonalbergo, and to move up north with my family. So I have a story of somebody that grew up in a place where I wasn't born in, which in my case was Lake Como, which is close to Switzerland, as farther as possible from the south. And I guess this left me with the idea that my family that was already scattered before we left, actually. I have aunts and uncles in Switzerland, in Rome, in Naples. Nobody actually stayed in our place of birth. And we were the third to leave. And it left me with that idea that our home was where we were. A family of four, really tightly closed, all embarking on a mission which at the time was like a mission of renewal, but also a mission of ambition. My parents were English teachers and they wanted to have a better future for us that we could have had in the South in terms of education, career, and everything. So on one hand, I was like really entrenched in this mission. On the other hand, I lived a life of eternal return because I would go back to my place of birth 3 to 4 times a year. And I just basically just learned to create home by separation, which is something that stays with me for the longest of times. Of course, this also gave me a lot of adaptive intelligence. Up to this day, if you put me in any hotel room, I'll be at home in a minute and a half. It's like very fast. But at the end, and then the other thing is probably that I learned is that stories are what recreates home. I think we lived with a lot of tales from my father almost every night, if not every day, and they still continues today, telling us about his childhood in his place of birth. The stories about the little town always stayed with us. And so there is this idea that I developed very early that you can create a home through stories. And I remember the first gift I've asked my parents was a typewriter. And I was like probably 5 or 6, and I would use this typewriter to type up stories and poems and things about my family that I would read back to them when I was in the South. And it probably was a way for me to preserve place or to actually make place. And then there was another tick that I probably bring with me even today, which is I had a very systematic way of playing with my toys. So I still remember these things resurfaced for me very clearly while I was going through this journey. I used to force my brother, who's a little brother, to do a census of all of our toys and divide them by categories and organize them by activities and have a very precise schedule. Or I don't know, I would go with my mom to the bank and just take out all the forms that I could take and then lay them back on a desk and just spend my whole day filling in forms and stamping them up. There was some like, how can I create order out of all this chaos, right? So I have to say this idea of placemaking and sense making stayed with me since I was a child, and I'm very active in the search of a place to call home even now.
Cool. Yeah, and it sounds, reading between the lines, that you also absorbed some homesickness from your father maybe, and that search for home that was part of his storytelling.
Absolutely. You're right. Yeah, I never seen it that way, but it's absolutely true. It's perennial. And I am, as I say, perennially ubiquitous. And now that you made me think about it, probably perennially homesick, probably.
I think this is something that's very familiar to immigrants all over the world, is the sense of that they're getting homesickness from their parents to a place that they actually never fully belong to.
Right.
But it's very tangible. And I definitely, and in some cases, it can be the reverse, right? It could be like that you get a lot of gratitude for growing up somewhere different than your parents did. So it affects us so much. So before we dive into your story, your odyssey, I'd love to hear how you define what you do today and how that relates to that early sense of placemaking and storytelling.
So I would say now I define myself as a creativity hacker, but that's just a way for me to fight the tyranny of a job title, if you want. The market requires one, and I wasn't finding one that could feel holistic enough or that could encompass all my diverse identities and senses of discovery. So what a creativity hacker is for me is, so first of all, why hacker? I try to turn the term upside down, because in the term hacker, I don't see anything violent or nosy, or I don't hear the word attack when I see hacker. I see someone that enters a system to understand the frustration and then gather the system around to take care of that frustration. So that's what I hear when I when I say the word hacker. It's more like a white hat hacker than it is the other kind. And creativity for me represents a word that has no limits. I've come from a career in communication and professional storytelling. I then upgraded that career with a new system, which is design thinking and design sprint. I've injected mindfulness and travel writing along the way. And it's just like a whole mix of things that I would not to leave out. Either I'm offering a service to a client or I'm helping a person. So creativity hacker for me is just a way to describe a portfolio career that I have now. Let's say pushing a varied mix of different ventures. I think one of the biggest realization after taking my sabbatical from my 12 years executive career is that now I have a clear understanding of what is a job and a clear understanding of what is work. The reason why I make this distinction is I am a children of immigration and I'm also a daughter of burnout. So you learn very fast how much energy you have that actually you could put into the system and how much energy you have left to transform in other energy, right? So for me, the distinction between work and job is very clear now. I remember when I quit my career, what I told myself was like, thank God I don't have a job, so I can do the work that I need to do.
Yeah.
You know? So there's a lot that goes on unsaid, unpublished, unLinkedIn, unpromoted that goes in a creative career that is a work of discovery, a work of healing, a work of understanding, a work of researching, a work of understanding your identity, understanding how much of that identity is for pay and how much of that identity is for discovery. I guess what I do as a job is I work with brands and organizations to help them navigate a very specific change, which is happening at the moment, which is a shift, first of all, of mindset and culture, but then also of processes and product, from a product-led organization to a people-led organization. If we think about brand, we leapt 180 degrees from the late 1800s, right? When brands were just like a certificate of guarantee that product was safe. And to now moving to brands that to be able to survive and to support themselves, they have to make a difference in people's lives or be inclusive or make people feel okay with who they are. So there's this gigantic leap that has happened in even 150 years, 160 years. And we live in mostly product-centered world still. And so there's a lot of work that needs to be done there. So it's a work of education. So sometimes I've worked with tech companies, pharmaceutical companies, or automotive companies that are the ones that are trying to shift this mindset for their employees first before doing it for the business model. And then I work more on the consumer goods side, I don't know, in food, music, or lifestyle, travel. And that's where it's actually not only about the education for the employees, but it's also what do we mean by creative strategy? Because creative strategy so far could have been something beautiful that people are inspired by, but now it has to be something meaningful that people can be impacted by. So how do we make that shift? So I help them as a hacker in their teams to lead them there. On the more personal side, that's when probably the accent is more on the storytelling aspect of things. I think change is very complex emotionally and cognitively. And I just gathered all the tools that I've used on myself or that I found along the way to other support group of people in transition. I organized these creative hack workshops that, of course, have a little bit of a stall with COVID because the in-person experience is super important for these workshops. And on the other end is like, how can we give meaning to the powerful stories of transition that lives in between this polarized narrative, right? So the polarized narrative between, oh, poor thing, you're transitioning and your story is a story of struggle and you're forgotten, or you're a hero and you're doing all these amazing things and you've succeeded, right? So between this polarized narrative of extreme success and extreme struggle, what are all the layers of transition that we can learn from? Kind of what you're doing right now with your podcast too. Like, how do I dive into the stories of the people in between to make sure that they can be helpful for other people in between, because transition is constant and change lives in our life forever.
Yeah, and it all relates in a weird way to brand, because so people, and I used to think of brand as this very markety BS concept until I started thinking about my own company and business and brand, and realized that it's about clarity and communication and values and what you actually stand for. And it involves, and it has to be real.
Right.
So it involves a lot of soul searching and actually understanding what you stand for and what you're bringing to the world. So this is super interesting, and we'll explore more of that. I wanted to take you back to something you mentioned before, which was, I think you said home by separation, defining home by separation.
Right.
And you did end up leaving Europe altogether. And so explain this concept to me of home by separation.
A lot of that concept has to do with my personal story of like literally having learned to say goodbye at least 3 times a year to the place that I thought I belonged to, and trying to make it in a place in which I ultimately just was trying to fit in, because I never belonged to the North. To this day, I never belonged to the North. And even if I move back to Milan, I'm like 20% here, 80% in the rest of the world. I think there is this need of, as you were talking before about branding, right? So branding is also a place. We compare to nature that doesn't need to name things to feel like it belongs. A tree doesn't need to know its name to know that it's a tree. Humans don't work that way. So humans need to name things and to feel like they can be safe and they can control. That can spiral also very like fast, but there's always a tension between good and bad. But I think that's what a place is, like something that can give you the illusion of control. But mostly, I think I make a difference between the idea of space and the idea of place. So let's just say space is something that realistically exists. It's a room, it's a country, it's a city, it's yourself. You exist in reality. What I call a place is the experience that you make of that space. So creating home by separation is like this idea of constantly creating a place, so then you can feel you're having a meaningful experience of the space you occupy.
So it's the feeling of making a home wherever you go, and having separation again and again, and having to start over again and again.
Yes, and that also is like the illusion of constant beginning is such a trap. I did what I knew how to do best. I transformed my career in a series of farewells, because that's what I was an expert in. By the age of 20, I've said farewell 4 times a year to my hometown constantly, and that's what I was a master of. So my career became a career of an expat, because every 3 years I would move country. Every 3 years I would have an opportunity and the adrenaline of a new beginning. And every year I would have the illusion that will never stop.
Yeah.
Now that I'm staying, it's a different experience. Because now that I'm staying, I'm just learning to endure with the fact that there's a cycle to everything, that life is not just beginnings. It cannot just be the recreation of place constantly, because that's just addiction. It's addiction to that experience of beginning.
Yeah.
So now I'm more thinking about the experience of return, because ultimately what I found out is that the experience of staying is a constant experience of return. You know, it's
It's interesting, and I relate very much to your story because I was an expat. I was born and raised in Israel, lived 10 years in New York, and I had this weird experience of heartbreak in both directions. Every time I was here and leaving for New York, I was sad, and every time I was in New York and leaving and coming back here, I was sad, and it was never fully complete or never fully feeling like home. And places are everything to us. They color our time and our experiences. They define our options. They hold our memories in a way. When I went back to my childhood, or the town where I grew up, all these memories started flooding in that I didn't access for many years, that I wasn't there during the years that I wasn't there. It's so powerful. And it's almost like unlocks part of who you are. So you left, and before talking about return, I want to talk about your time away, your time in the US, or your time, you called it, it's like a permanent expat. What was that like? And not to trivialize it, what was good about it and what was hard about it or negative about it? What's that experience like?
I think it depends on which perspective you want me to explore. From a personal perspective, I can start by telling you the reason why I left. The reason why I left is I was feeling a little claustrophobic. I was stuck in a narrative of categorization, which is often the case in a smaller country like mine, Italy, for example, in which when I left Milan, it was 2009. And either you were in fashion or gay or clubbing all night. There was a very little space for yourself to express your identity. It was like especially I was working in fashion, I was working in luxury, I was working in lifestyle. So obviously that world started feeling very small for me. I wasn't finding a place where I could actually express myself. Now, for example, Milan is a whole different place, talking about place, right? It went through a form of hybridation, which now allows more international people to feel at home. Now there's more art, there's more culture, there's more design, there's more freedom, there's more internationalization or whatever you want to call it, even in the architecture. So it's so much of how your environment is designed defines your emotional state when you wake up in the morning. Now, I always said that Milan, unfortunately, doesn't have an horizon. And that's one of the things I miss the most about the States.
The horizon. I mean, New York, you don't have a horizon. It's one of the things I miss. When coming back to Israel, I had a horizon and I have a beach, and New York was always like these tall buildings.
But the problem is, the difference is in New York, you can manufacture an horizon because it's enough to go to the top of a building, right? Here, before skyscrapers, there was no way we could go to top of buildings in Milan. And because the territory is very flat, there's literally like you miss an horizon. And that's why there's a thing like Milan escapism. People love to leave Milan. And this is a place and again, one of the reasons why I left is whenever somebody tells you that something in Milan is beautiful, they always use the sentence, "Oh, it's so beautiful, it doesn't look like Milan." That tells you a lot about the identity. So when I left, I was a little claustrophobic. I was lucky enough that my company responded to this need. And actually, when I asked to be moved abroad, this wonderful opportunity in New York opened up. And so I was there, I was doing my job. But mostly, I think it was a real initiation to who I really was. I think when you strip down of people that are looking at you, there's something very transformative that happens. That freedom of anonymity that I had in New York, I couldn't have in Italy. Walking down the street, just worrying about being myself because I knew nobody was at the same time terrifying and exhilarating. I remember swiping my first Metro card a week in, and the turnstile didn't stop, because that's also very difficult to do in New York. Swipe your card without getting stuck.
Yeah, it took a couple months maybe.
Exactly. A week or two into swiping my card, the turnstile didn't stop and I wasn't stuck. And I was like, oh my God, I'm a New Yorker now. It's so easy.
Yeah. There's this moment, I remember it very clearly, where it's a really complicated thing because you have to swipe, go quickly.
Yes.
Another person, and it's bi-directional, unlike some other places. And so someone coming in at you, exactly. And you need to be very confident and cut out and let them come in. And there's an art to it. And I remember that moment where I was like, oh, that just came naturally.
Absolutely. But that tells you a lot about a place. So for example, the fact that two people can come in both directions, you're not obliged to go in one, right? Yeah. First metaphorical hint in yourself. You're allowed to go both directions. Yay. Yeah. And then second thing is it takes something this small to feel like a New Yorker. Yeah. And this is something that I wasn't feeling in my own country at all. And I don't know if this is a story of everybody feels that in a country that's not theirs. They always say the grass is always greener and yada, but I think there's something that New York has energetically and from an identity perspective, and it also from having been born a brand. New York is being born a brand. It's a construct, same as Los Angeles. They are construct. So you basically buy into those values very quickly because they have a name. You've seen it in many movies. You've seen it advertised and promoted everywhere. You feel like you own a part of New York. It's the same process that you undergo with the product whose story is being told. I guess there is a relief, though, in belonging to a brand in that case, because I wasn't feeling my country was able to do a good job in giving me access to that freedom. Yeah. There's also the downside of it. I remember when I left for New York, I had 6 farewell parties in Italy. 6. This is how happy I was. Yeah. But then I arrived in New York and my company put me in a hotel room for a few months until I found a house. And I remember sitting down on the bed the first night I arrived there. And my thoughts exactly were, anybody, if I have to call somebody to go out on Wednesday, there's no one. I am completely alone.
And that takes a long time.
Takes a while to adjust to that. I remember I didn't take the metro. I didn't get out of 4 blocks for a week. And I actually, the first time I took the metro was like 10 days in. When I went to Brooklyn, I was like, okay, now I've arrived. But it's really scary. It's really scary. And there's a downside of, let's just say, endorsing the brand New York. The downside is when you come home, everybody stops asking you, how are you? Because you're in New York and New York is amazing and you're great. So you're supposed to be great. Yeah. So basically I lived for 3 years with all of my best friends, probably not talking to me about how I was at all, because the moment I would arrive here, it was like them unloading their problems on me and not allowed to have any problems because I lived in New York.
It's the perception and it's very flat. I resonate with that quite a lot. I also think the freedom and the all-encompassing nature of New York makes it feel very lonely sometimes because you have, even with, you call your best friends. So I got to a point where I have a lot of good friends in New York and you call them and you're like, let's do something. And they're like, I'm free 2 weeks from now. Yeah. My life is so full because this is New York. So I have an exhibit and I have a restaurant and I have this and I have that. And there's a poetry reading and it's all set and I can make time for you in 2 weeks.
Yeah. That's one of the reasons why you leave, right? It's like, all right, guys, if I have to schedule a brunch with my sister, I should probably just move on. Yeah,
it is. In Israel, the contrast was very high when I came back, when it was, I could call someone or people called me and be like, what are you doing right now?
Exactly.
And it was like, we're going for drinks or we're going for this. And it's okay, yeah, let's do it. Yeah. Yeah, interesting. And yet exhilarating to be there.
I had a second. I always say that while I was in New York, there was a thing that I used to say a lot, was like, I grew up thanks to my parents and New York. I think I had a second teenager years. I moved there when I was 27, left when I was 30. In these 3 years, it was like literally high school here with money. It was completely, I had a chance to redo a lot of what I've not done in my high school years, but as an adult. And so exploration, change of identity, I bleached my hair white. I left New York with 12 kilos more, weighing 12 kilos and with minus $25 in the bank. So that's how all consuming it is. Right?
Took everything. Yeah.
Everything. But in a good way, he shuffled the cards for me a lot in terms of mindset and mentality. And when you live in America, you think about the system a lot, which is not something that you are in touch, or at least when I left, because there was no social media and the world was not as global as it is now. You didn't have the feeling that you were part of an ecosystem, that you were part of something bigger than you while I was in Italy. Well, that's a feeling that you constantly have in America, and sometimes to a fault. Sometimes, especially in these times right now, it's very overwhelming to think about the system every day because of all the flaws that we're experiencing. But I think that there's awareness. It's very American.
Yeah, it's one of the amazing things and the hard things, but they are very systemic in how they view the world, and people are constantly talking about how to make the system better and what's going on and what's working and what's not working. But it's interesting that when we talk about the benefits of the US, a lot of it comes down to customer experience, where there's so many other things that are important to us in life. Yeah. Like friendship and love and community and nature and time off. And we don't talk about these things in relationship to the US. We talk about customer experience. And it took me a while to get used to the customer experience, the human type of customer experience that Israel has to offer. So for instance, for a while I was missing Fresh Direct. Do you remember Fresh Direct?
Yeah.
Okay. So it was one of my favorite things about living in New York is I have Fresh Direct. I have this app. The supermarket is solved. You decide when they come. It's super high quality, fresh food. I came back, nothing like this in Israel. Now there's a few things that begin to encroach on that territory. But I have a green grocer, 10 minutes away. I have his WhatsApp. I send him my list, and then a guy comes in and brings. And then whenever I send him my list, he's like, oh, we also have great mangoes. And he starts sending me photos of veggies. And I was like, oh, you know what? Yeah, let me add 2 mangoes. And it's very different from Fresh Direct, but it's awesome in its own way. And it's convenient and fast and human. Okay, do you want to talk about the move from New York to California?
I didn't move right away to California. I moved from New York to Paris, so back to Europe for 3 years. And I think what you were talking about, rigidity and fair play, I think that's the upside of America, but it's also somehow the downside in managerial style, in friendship, in relationships. So I felt like I was ready to have a European injection of that when I left New York, and the opportunity presented itself to move to Paris, which was a country that I didn't know the language of, first of all. So I spent the first 6 months in Paris not knowing French, which is an experience that I do not recommend to anybody. For me, placemaking there definitely meant learning the language, which was essential. Right. And I guess what I found was familiar values, similar to what I domestically experienced in Italy, but international mindset. So it was a good combination of, I found out that, for example, Paris looks up a lot to California more than New York. Milan looks up to New York a lot, and Paris looks up to Los Angeles a lot. And there is this weird admiration, co-admiration among all cities that I didn't suspect. Also, I learned that Paris is not France. Same way New York is not America. So there were some similar things that I could learn. And then 3 years after, and again, I lived my career in 3 years, did 3 years in 3 years, which is basically usually a startup time is when you reach break even, but then I kept moving. And then I moved to California, particularly when I was there. I was the global PR director for Oakley, which is eyewear sports brand. And that was a completely unfamiliar territory for me because I moved to Orange County, which I don't know if you know anything about it, but it's
I know it fairly well.
From the OC. So
no, from life. I have good friends who live there. It's
you do?
A very, very weird place.
It is. It's Black Mirror-ish. It's literally like the farthest from any set of value you've ever known. And talking about a construct, it is an artificial oasis. And the paradox...
I guess Irvine is kind of like that. It's spooky.
Yeah. I lived there for 3 months in Irvine.
Oh my God.
And I had 2 best friends that lived in Irvine. So I went to Irvine quite a bit, but then define what it means, go to Irvine. There's no center, there's no square, there's no town. So going to Irvine means going to somebody's place or going to the mall or crossing that specific highway. So I guess in terms of place, that for me was the place of total displacement. In a good way and in a bad way, both, of course. I think California gave me a lot of isolation that I was craving. Not because I decided so, but because the social dynamic over there is very different from any other social dynamic. Already, if I would have lived in LA, it would have taken me an hour and a half to reach any of my friends. I would have needed to schedule a parking, and I would have needed to block their calendar to see each other.
Right.
And that's LA. So imagine Orange County, it's even worse because people from LA can visit you, but it happens every quarter. And
it's an insane almost 2-hour drive, I think. And it's
90 minutes. Yeah.
And it's so many lanes on that highway that you just want to die. It's just like a sea of cars.
You don't want to turn sharp right when you're on the 6th lane on the left. Let me tell you, it's very scary.
But yeah, it's interesting. We talk about these places because I don't think these places could exist anywhere but America.
For sure.
Because they're like industrially designed.
Yeah.
And maybe people who don't know these places, it's worth talking about why they're so bad. But
there is good and bad. Like, I think the good part is they are so different that you're learning something every day. If you're a curious person, if you approach your work in an anthropological way, that's like prime spot for observing humanity.
Observing humanity in crisis and in unnatural
in like very weird setup. So I always said that Orange County is a place that doesn't want 4 things. They don't want fear, they don't want change, they don't want death, and they don't want ambition. Okay. So this is the 4 things. I created kind of like a quadrant for me to live in to explain the place, because I saw it in my team. I saw it in the streets. I saw it in the way they actually approach life and problems. Basically, it is a place designed to avoid disruption, to avoid distraction, to avoid issues, to avoid problems, and to be very protected from them. Everything is... But at the opposite side of this, everything is super easy, right? So
very convenient, yeah.
Very convenient, because difficulty is not a principle, is not a criteria, is not a design principle. It's not like there's no challenge at all. It is designed to remove every possible challenge. So the way you reach the supermarket, the way you can book a doctor, the way they can serve something at the restaurant, the way they deliver stuff at home, the way the streets are conceived, it's very easy. It's just very easy. Like when you come back in Italy after 3 years in Orange County, everything is so difficult.
Yeah. By the way, when we talk about Orange County, because I actually found some places I liked, like the orange itself is not bad, but places like Irvine, I guess the way I would define it is, or add to the things, that they're minimizing human contact with strangers.
Yeah, for sure.
Absolutely. That's a big design principle. And you can live there. And a friend who lived in LA, also in a building, both of them, by the way, both the friend from Irvine and the friend from LA moved to much cooler places now. But places designed to, so you have a mail room where you pick up packages. You don't even have to meet the person bringing you the packages. And then you have everything very convenient. Maybe you have to interact with some people, but it's mostly delivery. And then you have everything, the whole environment is set up to be in your car, driving to get something or to an appointment, and then in the mall buying something, and then at home.
Right.
And you don't see, it's almost like when you meet another person in the street, that's an unpleasant accident. It's the streets are not designed for that to happen.
Absolutely. Because there's some awkwardness in the encounter that they're really trying to minimize, but it's systemic. It is designed to make sure it doesn't happen. I remember when I was certifying in design thinking, I happened to have worked on a project on how to provide service for Orange County 70 years old, the elderly. Right. And one of the insights that I collected quite fast is that all the elder communities are out of sight, enclosed on a hill, and very hard to reach. So it's like they just want to avoid, like, also another insight I found out is there's no visible cemetery. How many times you stumble in a small village in Italy and all you can see is like the village and this very respectful, sometimes very cute place of memorial or cemetery where, their deads are as commemorated as the living cemetery.
New York is not like that. New York has a lot of, I lived 5 minutes from, what's the name of the cemetery? I mean, in Brooklyn, huge cemetery, beautiful statues and like a pond. And every time you leave New York, no matter in what direction, you're driving through huge cemeteries.
Right.
So in that respect, I think that's still the old world because it was still Europeans coming to New York to build it. And I don't know, there's something there that's still...
If you think about it geographically, right, the East Coast is definitely most European, like settlement happened there because the other coast is like, what, I don't know if it's 3,000 miles away. And it's, don't quote me on the number, I'll never be good at numbers, but it's 6 hours away. And it speaks a lot about also like geographically, if you think about a continent as a space to create a place, of course, like there's a lot of Europe that goes on the East Coast and a little less on the West Coast. So they managed to create these places that have their own rules. And and I was also shocked that religion over there is almost like a business, right? So you have, I remember getting lost one day and I ended up in a street, I think it was in Mission Viejo or something like that. And I remember there was a block in which there were 9 churches of 9 different religions, all with their taglines outside the door, all with their communities attached to it. And it felt an industrial settlement. A marketplace or something that you would see, like there was a district of tech and then there's a district of churches. So it's just beyond, like you go into Orange County as an observer because it's so different than what you're used to at all. For me, it was a place where I found myself in ways in which I couldn't find myself in any other place because of this isolation, because of this terrible difference, because of this complete gap of values. I actually turned back and look at myself.
And inwardly. Yeah. And I think that's what people do. And I think that's one of the strengths of Americans is they are very focused on self-development and self-fulfillment.
Absolutely.
And even in the religious, we would like to make fun of this religious marketplace, but it's very powerful. The US is also where Western Buddhism took hold and where mindfulness became popular and where these interfaith dialogues are happening, which are, I think, changing the world just by having
that's the upside of it, right?
That's the upside.
So if on one hand there is the commercialization of it, on the other end there is the hybridation. So what
innovation,
what makes it always possible is that if on one hand it turns into business right away, it's like what happens to a word when it becomes too common is the same, right? So what happens to storytelling? What happens to innovation? What happens to disruption? Like it becomes common sense and quite a boring word very fast because it's commercialized so heavily. But at the same time, it allows innovation to happen because it dismisses things fast and make it very hybrid with other influences. Therefore, the application to society is also fast. So there's upside and downside to both movements. It's hard to not get caught in the way and literally be like, okay, who am I now? Right?
Yeah.
After having experienced all these different influences, like, who am I?
Interesting.
So I guess it comes back to the fact that I always been probably two people right now, the placemaking one through stories, and then the system designers through the other part of my brain. So
Right.
it's the same with places. Once they're in you, what do you take from it, and how do you still maintain yourself despite them, you know?
Yeah. And we already touched on a lot of reasons why to end up coming back and returning to Italy. But I'd love to hear you talk about that a little bit more.
Mm-hmm. It definitely is a combination of factors. Let's just say that at the time in which I quit my job, I was 12 years into an executive career with a big corporation. And companies are like people most of the time. No, they are also organisms that go through different phases in their life cycle. And in my career, when I actually decided quitting, I by then have participated in 10 years of deep growth and deep expansion. I was a head of a division. I participated into this growth. And until another phase kicked in for the company, and the phase was a phase of merger and acquisition, change of management. And for someone that had identified so much with work for so long, of course, when there was this telluric movement, if you want, in what was happening around me work-wise or job-wise, that kind of triggered my own change a little bit. I was forced to ask myself, if all of this crumbles, who am I? And so I think that was a process that began for me in 2015, in a way. I left America at the end of 2017. But in 2015, I had what I call a radical act of self-attendance. I was in my kitchen in California, and I had this beautiful house that I conquered with my beautiful career, and I had my job and everything. And all of a sudden, I had this moment, and I actually felt it physically. And that moment, it was a voice that was telling me, you are your own home. So it was like a whisper. It was weird. To this day, I don't know what provoked that. But that was the beginning of a series of realizations that, as I was witnessing so much change happening in my work environment, that triggered something inside me. Because at the same time, I was going through a personal shift myself. I am what I've always called a corporate artist. Even since college, the question that my father asked me before college was, do you want to be an artist, or do you want to work with artists? Because I always had this double mind. And I remember the day that I applied to one of the most prestigious business schools in Milan, I also did an audition for a theater school, and they were in the same street. So it was like, actor or manager, you know?
Wow.
It was a little confusing, because there was a part of me that was the artistic side, that was the one that was helping me elaborate change all my life with the writing and with the art and etc. And then there was a part of me that was very systemic, and that ended up helping me having a very fast career in management. But as soon as, like, when I was in the thick of that career, I would be an artist in a life that I would sneak, you know, after hours into my life as a manager. I would have a blog that I never picked up, or I would create artistic movie that I never distributed. All of this after hours, because I felt I needed to keep the systemic going and the artistic going at the same side and at the same time. I guess it's because in that particular moment of change, the journey was unsettling. I ended up creating many ways to feel like I was coming home. And one of these ways was going back to writing, for example. I started testing my idea of being a writer a little bit like a proxy. I was using being a writer as a beacon for future experiences. And so I took classes and I went on writing retreats. And then I started writing essays. And then I started waking up earlier and earlier to be able to write before going to work and all of that system. And until it became a request, until one day I went to my boss and I was like, I am taking 2 weeks. I'm going to Japan. I'm going to be with 18 artists and I'm going to be their storytelling coach. And she's like, all right, whatever you need. She was very open.
Nice.
But I was experimenting with different identities. And at the same time, I created a system to learn what's going on. What is that I really want? And I've done anything except for like drugs. I've tried every single methodology to dig into yourself. I started therapy, I started leadership coaching, I started creative courage coaching, I started storytelling coaching. I went to an astrologer, I did crystal bath, like I did everything, which of course, if you're in California, you're always surrounded by this holistic narrative. Yep. But I learned my way to use it for myself in a way that was also adventurous, and also to pick the right guides and the right mentors to be able to go there. And just I tried everything I could to unlock myself. I think I found a term for this along like in my studies recently. Like there is this novelist called Nicola Baker, and he calls those type of events alert intermissions. I don't know if you ever heard of that.
No.
It's alert intermission. They're basically events that happen in your life that produce insights. So then through those insights, you can progress a little bit more in your search, whatever your search is. Who am I, or what do I want to be? And normally you don't manufacture these events, but I felt like I did need to create a lot of unexpected random things to happen to me, because I wanted to see myself reacting differently to my life than the way I was reacting at the time. So I use them as tests if you want.
I know this very well, and I know this is going through periods of life. It's search, but I just say yes to everything that comes up just to see what happens.
Yeah, exactly. Because I guess the insights, the beautiful thing about change is that the insight doesn't come from thinking about it, right? So the insights comes from acting on it. And that's a lesson that I've learned as I was trying to transition to another life, as I was trying to change, and as it was super daunting, the idea that I would never understand what was going on. Yeah. And the only way to understand it was to actually do things. And that actually is totally against my character. Like, I am a brainiac. I'm an overthinker. If you leave me in a room with 10 books, I'm happy. So for me, I was forcing myself to get out of that mindset. And I was also asking myself professionally, when you work in communication and in PR for so long, I asked myself the hard questions, right? Am I doing storytelling or am I doing story selling? So how can I go back to the source? How can I go back to the craft before even moving forward with the other part of my career or whatever that is? So I guess so there was a trigger from external causes. Then there was a trigger from something that I would create. And then there were life triggers, because 2016 was a little bit of a crazy year. It was the year when the biggest intermissions of all happened. It was life telling me, okay, it's either now or never. My mom got cancer. Trump got elected, and my green card got pushed off 2 years. Wow. There were more layoffs at the company happening, and I was getting very well at defending my team through negotiations and politics. That's also take a strain on your energy. And I fell in love. So 2016, life was just telling me, all right, change is on the menu. Wow. And I guess it was just inevitable for me that at some point I would decide to come back. There's also a time that happens. There's also something that happens while you're transition and you're in this turmoil that is like, you have to become an observer of your life way more than you were before, because signs comes and go, and you can catch them and make something about it, or you can very much ignore them. Yeah. So one of the reasons why we change or we don't is that we are trained to see the signs or we're not. In my case, I think one day after 2 years of search, after 2 years of this turmoil, of this corporate artist struggle and search and new system design, I woke up one day and my apartment was completely flooded. Water everywhere. And so the apartment complex moved me to a hotel in Dana Point. I stayed in the Best Western for a week while my home was getting fixed. And you asked me before what it means to create a home by separation. A home by separation is when you actually allow yourself that break room to detach from life and look at the change that you're going through and get perspective. And that's exactly what happened to me. And one day I woke up and Orange County is a surveillance state. So there's no crime and there's nothing happening in the streets. Everybody's in bed by 9. But that morning, there were police officers and a task force banging on a door right next to my hotel. They were waiting for somebody to come out. And at some point, they knock on the door, they have guns in their hands, and they enter the apartment, and the suspect is gone, right? And I look at this scene, and I'm like, oh my God, I am the suspect. For me, that was a moment of realization in which I was like, I realized that I was rooting for that suspect to have escaped.
Right.
I was like, please don't be there.
Part of the system. The system is oppressing us, and the person being gone is like a moment of rebellion and hey,
exactly.
I can be out of here too.
I am the suspect. And so the morning after I woke up, and I remember I looked at the ceiling, and it was the easiest decision of my life to decide, all right, I'm going back home. Also facing all the demons that are back home, because coming back is not easy, because you're coming back to the idea of yourself that you left here. And I decided to take a year off, a sabbatical year of nothing, experimentation, giving up the social status, the job title, the 2,000 contacts on my phone, social media. I gave up social media for 500 days and just be and try what that means. And yeah, coming back to being thankful for not having a job because I had a lot of work to do.
Yeah, there's so much in that decision. And it's very lucky that you had this ability to take a year off. So tell me about the challenges of returning. Why, for a lot of people, it sounds like the easy thing to do. Oh, just go back home. Why is that challenging?
All right. First of all, I think I was very confident when I came back home, because the awareness and the story that I was telling myself was like, okay, the cost of staying where I was would have been higher than the cost of leaving that place. So I felt very confident. I felt very strong. I think I came here with a lot of enthusiasm, and also with what I now call the sabbatical illusion, that if you have a lot of time on your hands, you're absolutely going to spend it all. The first challenge that I've encountered was a challenge of conditioning. After working full time and after being on call 24 hours a day, after mastering the business hours and the business mindsets, there was a conditioning left in my body that wouldn't allow me to rest at all. I think I struggled with doing nothing. I've struggled with resting. I've struggled with being able to find true relaxation. And I remember the first month, I've scheduled so many things. I transformed so many things into a job. I became a perfect housewife. I became a perfect Italian citizen of re-entry. I became a perfect daughter. I became a perfect partner. And I had to visit every place in Milan that I've never been to, and yada, yada, yada. And I remember talking to a friend who's actually a Buddhist also. After a while, she was like, I'm very glad to see that you're transforming your life into a job without a salary. And so I was like, it's right. I had my father calling me every week and asking me, what are you doing? And me answering, I'm doing this and this. And he would say, you have to do nothing, and would hang up the phone. So that was the first challenge, I have to say. It's not just coming back home, but just like switching models for yourself. That was the first. The second was definitely many layers of cultural clash. Again, let's remember that I was living in Orange County and that everything was at the tip of my finger and everything was super easy and service was excellent and obstacles were removed.
Right.
And you moved to a country like Italy, in which I was Italian, and it took me 3 months to become Italian again. Bureaucracy, lines, Guardian of the Galaxy thing, very slow bureaucracy. I had to fill form over form, photocopying, faxing. It was just madness. Same madness for getting a Wi-Fi line in the house or for switching my phone. Like, I kid you not, for 3 months, I actually had to actively work at reintegrating into the country. Of course, that was occupying a lot of my mind, and it was good training because my mind wasn't used to not be occupied. So there was an advantage to that. But at the same time, it took a lot away from the spiritual journey that I was supposed to have. The third part is definitely the spiritual journey. And when I say spiritual journey, I don't mean wishy-washy things. You having to face the biggest demon of all, which is coming back to your family and the dynamic that you left there 10 years ago. 10 years ago, my parents knew me as an evolved teenager looking for herself. Right. And now I was coming back a strong woman, doubting everything I had in my life and ready to start forward. That's not easy when your parents are there to remind you that you are a creature that needs to be protected, while you're somebody that's trying to take more agency than it was ever given to her in life. So there's that clash. Whatever is going on within yourself that you feel needs to be solved. Like, I vowed that I would create a creative life for myself, but have I really ever invested in it, right? Or was I stopped from guilt, shame, fear, or whatever was stopping that creative life? I had to solve it. I had to look this fear in the eyes and find ways to solve it. I had to forgive a lot of people.
That's part of the journey for sure.
Yeah, there's a lot of forgiveness that is necessary, including myself, I have to say. Listen, I come from a family that was the first to graduate college in their family, that basically was on a mission to create a whole new model for us. And through what I was doing, I was obviously creating a new model for us. And now it's changing the model again. And for something that nobody has ever seen. I didn't have a model for this. Nobody in my surroundings has ever taken a sabbatical. I had to actively look for community that actually had the similar experience. Not only because I wouldn't feel alone, but because it's such a complex experience that, again, the narrative is, oh, I take a sabbatical, I have a great time. The reality is you take a sabbatical, you deal with very hard things, and you need support to do that. I grabbed for community as soon as I could. The first 2 people that I met in my journeys were sabbaticans. And then I met a third, and then I met a fourth. And it's very important to have a supporting extra family that understands this change of model that you're trying to reach, because it's not seen every day.
Let's take these things one by one. So you mentioned the culture shock. And so I think the first question that someone who hasn't experienced it, because I know what you're talking about, of having culture shock with your own supposed culture when you come back after a long time. But what is that about? What's the component there? I
think there are different levels to it. So there's one level that is universal. It doesn't happen only when you come home. It happens whenever you go through a change. Whoever is not going through that change is going to look at you and fear for their lives. So that is the biggest obstacle, because they project on you a fear that they don't want, like fear of losing money, fear of losing the job, fear of losing all the stable things that they have. So they project all these fears in you. Therefore, it's a very solitary time because a lot of people are like, oh, that's great what you're doing, but I don't want to touch it because you remind me of what I would never do.
Right.
So it's a very lonely moment. And I have to say, Italian culture, and I'm talking about this from a distance as if I was an Italian,
Right.
but it's fair to say that there is a lot of envy and a lot of I will take you down culture that doesn't exist in America. In America, there's a lot of support. There's a lot of cheering for you. There's a lot of mentoring. There's a lot of how can I give you my tools so you can do better. And here I didn't find this. No matter how much I stimulated that, no matter how much I poked people for it, it was always, at the end of the day, the conversation was always, yeah, I'll tell you my point of view, but how can I take you down because you're competition, right? And that happens when I was going through sabbatical and when I re-entered the market. So I think that for me was a huge culture shock. I couldn't wait to end the sabbatical and just go to New York, which I did right away. During my sabbatical, I went back to California because I just wanted to try back.
You're cheating. You're cheating on your sabbatical.
I was cheating. Oh, yeah. I cheated from the second I started the sabbatical because I actually worked at a lot of projects during my sabbatical. Like I conjured a lot of ventures that some of them went nowhere and some others, they were just tests. How can I test all the possible selves that I have that I didn't have the time to test? And so it wasn't, again, it was a time of rest and nothingness and relaxation, but it was also a time of, can I try this? I try that. And again, a little bit like Michelangelo, I basically sculpt this and what is not David, you know? Right. So you learn by excluding what you don't like. So
when you go back to you're going through this culture shock, one of the things that I found really interesting is you made a prejudice inventory.
Oh gosh, absolutely.
So what is that about?
Oh, the prejudice inventory. I wish I could pull this out. There were like 25 prejudices that I had, but definitely it was like all the prejudice that I had against Italians that I would wanted to challenge myself and overcome and see if I could overcome them. Something like, again, instead of being supportive, they're jealous, or they, let's just say, when we do work deals, they tend to get manipulative and all of these things that I had in mind because I worked for a global company, but that at its core was Italian. So there were some things that are behavioral that are happening because of culture that I wanted to see if it was the culture of the country too. And yeah, I don't remember from the top of my mind. If you want, I can pull that list out.
I found the idea of the list of the inventory really powerful. And I found that I went through a similar process when I came back. I wrote a blog post about, or I think it was a core answer about the differences that I was seeing. I created overheard in Israel posts that were things that someone said that could never happen in the States. So one of the things that I remember is I was walking by the beach and there's a lifeguard on the megaphone and he's talking to a kid. And so everybody, hundreds of people are hearing this one person talking to a kid. And he's saying, I told you many times, don't get near these rocks. It's really dangerous. Why can't you just listen to me? What's going to become of you? What kind of future? It's basically guilting him into. And I was like, but this was an intimate conversation. Like this man talking to a boy who's insisting on swimming near these rocks. And it was this very natural conversation on a megaphone with hundreds of people listening.
I love it. So, I think I remember one prejudice that I wrote down is that Italians don't love Italy.
Yeah.
Because this is something that I've experienced a lot. Like abroad, if you're Italian, you're like a goddess, right? You come from this place everybody aspire to live. Yeah. You are like the non plus ultra of who knows life, who knows how to live life. And then here, if you go around in the streets, it's just people harassing each other about not being happy here. Yeah. And there's a lot of violent conversations about being fed up with this place, comparing this place constantly to other places. Of course, I'm not talking for all Italians. It's just like a general feeling. It's more like, is there something in the love that we have for our place that needs a reframing? So it's more of a question than an answer that I'm looking for. Is what is the right question to ask myself as I go through challenging myself on these prejudices that I also have. You know?
Yeah, it's interesting. I feel there is definitely a sense that when I came back, I had much more positive view of Israel than people who are living here.
Yeah.
And I think it's because we all tend to cling to the negative. Mm-hmm. We're wired this way to pay more attention to the negative and to not be grateful, and it takes coming back from a different situation to experience the good things that are just like water to fish, like they're not experiencing them as the unique traits of this place. Only the bad things are associated with the place. The good things are just life. And you come from a different place. You come from Irvine to Italy. There's going to be many positive things that are going to stand out.
That are given for granted, for sure.
That people are taking for granted. And the same with coming back from New York to Israel, even the sky, just seeing the sky on the horizon, just seeing just the nature, the amount of light is insane here. Just amount of light throughout the year. Things that were depressing to me. Things that one of the most important things for me was coming back and learning to see myself not as a broken American, but as an Israeli, as someone who's not worse, is different in the way I speak. Israelis interrupt more. Right. They are more brutally honest. They tend to be more clearly opinionated and more open about their beliefs. And I could get in trouble, and they're less respectful of authority. They're actually very extreme egalitarian in the business world. Whereas in the US, you have a boss. And I got into trouble in the US, or you get into uncomfortable situations, and you think, oh, I'm bad, or I don't know how to work things. And then you come back here, and it's all so natural, and everything works the way that you are wired to work. And you tell someone your blunt opinion, and they're like, really? And they take it fine. They're not upset by it. And I think that was part of for me, there was a sense of a very positive thing of seeing things that maybe other people take for granted, but I was very thirsty for.
Right. I think now you make me think about one thing. I think both cultures, like American and Italian, they have different way of handling procrastination of the problem, for example, right? So what you were saying about the American, let's take the workplace, for example, is this idea of a hierarchy and this idea of a structure for meetings and this idea of etc. But most of the times when you're in meetings with only Americans, is about, okay, we'll do this by next Friday. Okay, I'll get back to you by next Friday. And that never happens. And that their way of procrastinating the problems is not taking responsibility, right? In Italy, we take a lot of responsibility and we voice a lot of opinions, which is wonderful, because then you can have a confrontation, you can have a debate, you can have a relaxed conversation. Right. But at the same time, we use another device for procrastination, and that is complaining. Complaining just delays the problem. So both cultures have their own way of handling something that paralyzes both. Right. So it's, for me, I'm approaching my own country as a foreigner, because understanding somehow, I hope it becomes feeling. I'm still not completely immersed in my Italianity after almost 3 years here. I'm still, but I keep saying I'm still, but probably I will never, because as you say, like, I'm not worse, I'm different. So that difference is made of all the places that I've been through. I'm not going to lose that just because there's an expectation that I came back home, so I should lose that. When I did my talk at the beginning of the year at Creative Mornings, right, on the design of return and my personal story of coming back, I was obviously in the room, there were people that came back home like me.
Right.
There were foreigners that lived in Italy. There were people that traveled and came back. But then there were also people that did not have the expat experience, did not travel. They lived in Italy all their lives. But at the end of the talk, there was a young mother that approached me in tears because my story of transition and like finding my identity despite what everybody else's think resonated with her because she just became a mom. And she was also a very successful journalist. And in Italy, there is an expectations that if you're a successful businesswoman and you become a mom, you have to drop one identity in favor of the other. And she was struggling with making that transition. And that's very much about what I was telling you about before. Is like, how do you facilitate my success instead of putting categories and guardrails so then I will never reach there? So this is a narrative that happens more often than not here, that I didn't see that much happening in American, or at least they're doing a very good job to cover it.
Yeah, it's not politically correct. So I think you dealt a lot with this question, and which is something that I've been also less consciously and less systematically than you, but very deeply also doing. What does it mean to return well?
Wow, what a question.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think the first thing that comes to mind is that I'm not sure about that term because a lot of the experience of return has to do with the suspension of judgment. So if you suspend judgment, then your world is no longer designed in good or bad or wrong, evil or angelic.
Yeah. So I guess maybe that's it. Maybe instead of saying, what does it mean to return well? Maybe I mean, what does it mean to return skillfully?
Listening. Right? Very important skill of a return done. I was so bad at listen that I had to create a whole design project to go back to my own little village and interview all the people about what they thought, because I was bad at listening. And I had to create an interview project to learn how to listen to the voice of my own town. And so listening is definitely a skill that is super important in the process of return. Because what happens from listening is empathy, which is another skill.
You talked about giving yourself time to move through these different emotions and, grieving the place that you leave. So talk about that aspect of the emotional journey.
Yeah, I think time, it's a very interesting variable. I think is what in my mind has shifted the most. Not only the value of time, but the definition of time, the use of time. And I have to say, it's probably the most scarce resource that I had in my past life. Because, of course, I lived a life of higher productivity. Time was something we should cheat on, pretty much. You have to cheat on time to be able to produce at that level. You have to ignore the seasons, because it's not like from a business perspective, but from a personal perspective, like a Monday in January is the same as a Monday in December, when you're only highly productive. The best advice that I've ever received from another sabbatican was live your sabbatic year like a tree would. So you blossom in the spring, and then you have flowers in the summer, and then you harvest, and your foliage is going to fall in the fall, and then you hibernate in the winter. And of course, we are not in the world of manual labor anymore. So our seasons happen in a day, they don't happen in months. But it is something to keep in mind is how can I design time to prioritize not my emotions, but my body? Because I think I've learned to use my body as a device to send me alerts, to listen to when something is wrong, and to learn how to say no. I have noticed something incredible shaping during my sabbatical. And that is that every day of the week, time meant something different for me emotionally. Like I've noticed that Mondays for me, independently from the fact that I have a job or not, are highly productive days. And there are days for organizing. If I try to think and write on Monday, it doesn't happen. So I just let it go. I taught myself to let go and just accept that Mondays are a very productive day, and that's what I need to do, organizing. I've learned that Wednesday is my energy peak of the week, and I let it happen. And if on Thursday I crash, I don't put appointments, and I just Netflix and chill.
Nice.
And then, of course, I'm designing my life in a way that my job commitments are in tune with my emotional time. It's not always possible. Sometimes it's impossible, right? In the world that we live in the world of shareholder values, and it's tough to make this comprehension. But I think it's enough for the intention to be there. And grief happens in 5 stages. And you can grieve a project not gone well, as you can grieve a family member. It's always grief. And it's the same emotional cycles that you go through. And if you don't attend to that, it's going to come back.
Yeah.
You
can grieve a place. You can
grieve a place. You can grieve anything. You can grieve a pandemic. All this idea that we are returning to normal. No, we all feel like shit right now, guys. Like that's what's happening.
Normal, yeah.
It's okay. Let's accept it. It's normal to let this feeling go through your body, and your body is your sentinel, and it just tells you everything you need to know. While I was in highly productivity mode, I had the weirdest diseases. Every December, I would lose my voice. Every December, I would have 2 weeks of pharyngitis. Every year, I would literally lose my voice. I hurt my back twice. I went to the hospital for panic attacks, I think 6 times. And all of that is because the system was not letting the emotional energy flow through. Because I was readapting to whatever was asked of me from a productive perspective without letting the rest do its work. I think I'm
being
closer.
A whole person.
Yeah. And we forget that when we talk about a whole person, we talk about a person that's part of nature. And it's not just a whole person that ends in my head and starts in my head and ends in my ankle. Like we're talking as an organism, part of an ecosystem. So we are also ourselves ecosystem. And so I don't understand why we shouldn't have seasons.
Yeah, I like the idea of move like a tree. I also like, so when I came back, I thought back at originally leaving and what a big break I made. And what a big kind of total. I'm not coming back. I'm living in New York now. I'm going to make new friends here, and everything in the past life is put in a box. Maybe once a year I'll go back in the best of cases, but there were also times where for several years I didn't. And so I thought about what a big break and what a heartache it was to actually every time to come back and the box suddenly opens and it's still there. And so I decided to do the opposite, to not go to go back to Israel, but not put New York in a box. I'm still part New Yorker. I'm still listening to my American podcasts and communicating with my American friends, and I'm here and I like my daily life here, but I'm refusing to make a break because I'm one person and you can't put part of me in a box.
Right.
I think you've been doing something similar, but maybe more intentionally, but also at the same time, taking the time to reconnect with Italian culture, reconnect with the country, so experiencing the old more deeply. Do you want to talk about like that transition itself and shaping it in a way that kind of suits the type of life that you're trying to create?
So starting from my sabbatical, I think one of the first things that I did was having this need. It was an emotional need to tell myself a new story about the place where I actually came from, the small village from the south.
Right.
I realized I've always had the same story in my mind. I don't know. The story went from I belong to this place and no one else. So every other place is not home to, oh no, wait, I've been to many places that feel like home. Am I betraying my original home? So I went through a lot of rounds of telling this story in my head. When I was a kid, I was very rigid about that. I am from Buon Albergo. I am not from Como. I will never be. And like, I was very protective of that story. And I think the first thing that happened is like, all right, what if I try to understand and look at this place with new eyes? I think it was an emotional need that ultimately ended up becoming a design project. When the mayor and the committee of entrepreneurs and farmers called me up, like, we're trying to repopulate our place. We're trying to figure out ways to revamp the territory. Would you help? And I took that as a very personal opportunity, actually. The project that we ended up doing didn't see the light of day, ultimately, because of many reasons, political, funds, mentality, whatever the reason was. But the most important part is that I spent part of that year connecting with the dark side of the place that I've idolized my entire life. So understanding really even the bad side of the character of my people, understanding their pain, understanding my pain, understanding what was good and what was bad. It ended up being more like an ethnography research project in which we would listen to the town and then we would design a system to repopulate the town based on what the town needed. So that was the framework. I obviously needed some convincing to do because that's not normally how these projects are thought about. There's a line of funds that comes from the European Union, and then there is a mayor that sponsor several projects, and then the several projects do in a fragmented way different activities to revamp the place, or there are the houses for $1, all the usual suspects of systemically solving this problem. What I wanted to suggest was like, let's start from the people and then see from there if we can devise a system that is connected, so then you don't have gaps in the journey, so that is sustainable. So then you can start something in 2021, but then you can go on for 10 years and repopulate it systemically, and not just like with a big splash of money that does one thing and then nothing else. So for me, that was a moment in which I, again, got to interview my family, my long distance cousins that have not been in touch. I've interviewed a woman from Argentina that immigrated there in the 50s. I had a larger understanding of what that place was for everybody. And I also forgave the place for a lot of things that are not right, like the divisiveness, the fact that is, for how it is geographically built, a place of transition. And I've been taught never build houses on bridges. And that was definitely a bridge, the way it was conceived. So it's letting go grief, that the fact that place will never going to be a place of stability. It was always going to be a place of transition. Let go of the dreams that I had in the past of moving there and opening a farm and just living my life. Like a lot of things that I've idolized. And so there's a lot of me that dealt with the broken dreams of being Italian. But at the same time, I took a lot of strength from it because I felt very close with the person. And that person was the place where I was born in. I was accepting another parent in a way. So that was probably the deepest I've gone during the sabbatical, on top of the relationship with my closest family, my brother, my mother, my father, whatever. It is there that you want to confront. I think there is also an aspect of adventure. I've transformed what for many people would be maybe a regular weekend or something that they would give for granted because Italy is beautiful, in an adventure to understand what it was behind it. So I ended up, for example, at the Juliet Club in Verona, volunteering to answer love letters coming from all over the world. I don't know if you knew about that. Actually,
I would love to. I'd love to hear more about this in a second. But yeah, no, it's because you went into there's a series of things that you described doing, including a very systematic way of reconnecting with your family and your family members and taking the time to get to know them one-on-one again.
Yeah, I took them away from the living room.
Yeah.
And that was a very generative project, actually, because you take your family away from the kitchen table and wonderful thing happens. Like you start talking like adults. You start seeing them as people. A lot of things come up from your life that you didn't know. And that was a very healing process, actually.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes me want to try doing the same thing. And you also described, and you mentioned this before, but these 500 days of silence and essentially not putting anything out there on social media. And what was that? I can't imagine doing that. That's very radical.
Hard.
Yeah.
It was hard at the beginning. I think I am still of there. Like I started another round of not posting this year. It's just like something that I'm doing systematically because I've more and more created a creative routine for me that needs this sort of deep thinking. And my deep thinking was constantly interrupted by thinking about other people or getting too much information in my head that it wasn't coming from my insights, but from other people's. And on the other hand, in a position of vulnerability like you are, with no job, no title, no role in the world, it was very hard to look at the success of other people or however they would describe it. That took a toll on my mental health at the beginning because you have a muscle that's very well trained with social media, and that's comparison.
Yeah.
So nobody is exempt from this. Everybody is a victim, no matter what people say. I think it's just an automatic mechanism that has been created. I've seen this with, now I have the awareness that this happened with brands as well. Right? The iPhone was launched and put us in a state of loneliness and solitude that we were not used to. And that triggered a new wave for branding. As Debbie Millman says, brands as connections and connectors. So that's when it happened that brand became the owners of connections. When connection was taken away from us. You know what I mean? Like it was enough to put a device in the market that we would become more lonely people to then crave this connection and create a system that would allow this connection to happen again and then become slaves to that system. Now I see it. It's not conspiracy theory. It's just naturally what happens in a system when you integrate something that creates a new behavior.
Yeah.
You know?
There's this movie, The Social Dilemma, that everybody's talking about now.
Yeah.
And one of the things, I think it was Tristan Harris who said in that movie, I just want to be able to connect with a fellow human without there being an intermediary with a very different incentive structure in between us.
Absolutely.
And you think about it, and oh my God, my communication is like Facebook, is Zoom, WhatsApp is also Facebook, and they want something from you. They're not just neutral channels.
Right.
So that's really interesting. And then you did talk about the Juliet Club. That sounds so fascinating. So I'd love to hear more about that story.
Sure. I guess it was a matter of how can I love my country more if not understanding love better, right? So this is the process that I go through with my mind. It's, okay, where in my country I can find love? And this happened completely by chance. In the past 2-3 years, it happens to me that once a month, I wake up at 4 a.m. and I have to let it go. I know I'm not going to go back to sleep. It just happens. And I know that happens for a reason. It's because in those 3 hours, something is going to happen. Something's going to find me. And I don't know what it is. I'm just the receiver, right? It's like almost like praying time for me. So I woke up at 4 and just scavenging in the internet, I found this Juliet Club, which, by the way, I remembered in 2015, I sent a letter to Juliet asking for love. And in 2016, I found love. So it works.
Wow.
Right?
Does it have to be in Italian, or can I? No, I can send
every possible language. The beauty of that archive is that they open the cabinet and it's like China, Japan, France, US, Emirates, wherever. And what I didn't know when I sent my letter to Juliet, otherwise I would have put an address on it, is that there's actually, since 30 years, I think it is, a bunch of volunteers that are there to answer these letters.
Wow.
Which is amazing. It's like as close to an incredible human experience as you can get. So I was like, all right, I'm jumping on a train, I'm getting there, and you have to ask for it. Like basically they vet you as a volunteer a little bit. So then you don't go there and harm this, poor girl in Ohio who's 17 years old and her boyfriend doesn't like her and you have to console her, right?
So let me just, before we go into the details, understand the basic concept. So people are sending letters to Juliet in Verona.
The Shakespearean
Juliet. And they're telling her about their heartache or their failures in love or their wishes. And then Juliet responds.
Correct. Okay. Only anybody can be Juliet. That's the beauty of it. Correct.
Okay. And so you go into there and you go through the vetting.
Yeah, you go there and you tell them which languages you want to answer into. So I pick Italian and English. And it's just it's a spiritual experience because it makes you feel connected. And at the same time is a little bit of activism, if you think about it, because mostly what they give you, they don't tell you what to answer, but they give you a hint. What are they trying to say is a bigger message? Because a lot of the people are writing back because nothing creates duality in love like the story of Romeo and Juliet, right? It's like not finding Romeo is the ultimate struggle in love. While in reality, the ultimate struggle in love is not finding yourself. So what you're there to do is to make them come back to that idea that they are of value, even without Romeo. And it has nothing to do with gender or sex. It's more about how do you help them come back to themselves? At least that's how I interpreted the kind of love that they're trying to promote. And for me, it was like an exercise, of course, in writing, but also I felt like a little bit of an activist in that time. Only you're an activist with a 17-year-old girl in Ohio in a room. You have a huge responsibility of the words that she's going to read. Yeah. Especially in countries especially from people that are not coming from big cities, that they don't have a lot of contact except for social media and going to the mall.
Yeah.
And it's a huge responsibility, but I felt chosen in a way by my waking up at 4 a.m. and finding this. And I found it was a fantastic exploration for the year I was in, because I was interested in that kind of love. Like what I was preaching to the girls, I was preaching to myself.
Yeah, that's such a powerful story. And I resonate with it through, do you know Eric Fromm, The Art of Loving?
Absolutely.
It's become almost like my Bible in the past few years. But this idea of love as not depending on finding the right person. Sure, you need a person who is able to love, but it's all about becoming a loving person. And love is a skill. And love is a skill of being together while also being completely yourself.
I love that idea. And also, we can put it back into love, time, trust, empathy, skill set of the return done well. Yeah.
And I think it's all connected. Beautiful. And so you talk about the importance of finding a community to do this with. And you found fellow travelers, fellow returners, and also you joined a community of writers. I'd love to hear about how do you go about rebuilding, because this is something that I've only partially been able to do since coming back. And so talk about that. How do you rebuild a community?
So with the writing, for example, it was the office that I have in my head took an executive decision. It was like, it's time to take your writing seriously. And so that was easier compared to other type of community, because I've applied for a fiction writing master I took for a year with 12 fellow travelers at the Holden School in Turin. And that was just a magnificent journey, because what that forced me to do, on top of re-entering the craft and relearning the skills and perfecting that, was to actually have a group with whom I could go through this incredible journey of transformation. And they were there with me as witnesses. So through that year, I have elaborated and grieved and wrote about a lot of the things that I needed to just put into the system or like let go. And then it just became serious business for me. Now I have a writing practice, and even if it's not yet in the realm of I have a book I'm publishing, not yet there, but it's just the seriousness that it took into my life make me feel alive and connected and on purpose, no matter what. My girlfriend always tells me, if you would be stranded in a desert island, you will be fine because you will be writing. And it's very true of my nature also, that I reconnected with. So that gave me a lot of strength in thinking, okay, so community is not something that can harm me right now, like I'm thinking of social media. It's something that can really help me. The other part of the community that I created during that year, because I was letting go of the 1,200 followers, I've connected with 8 people, like 8 that year, and it was a blessing, because every single person had a specific power that I could connect with, and every single person I could have deep conversations with. And in a time of transformation, especially if you're like not here, not there, I wouldn't recommend reaching out a ton, but rather selecting the energy that you want around you, that challenge you or ease your life. It depends on what you need. And just to bear witness to each other. I think I've gone very deep into this transformation with these 8 people. One of them is Nirupa Umapathy, which is...
Connected us,
Connected us, exactly. So there's that. And then, of course, I started feeling the yearning for a larger community, because imagine I also come from a job that basically was being the connector of communities. So I was used to hang out with so many different people from so many different realms, and I needed to understand if I wanted to replicate that for my life, and so start off a new network, and B, understanding what do I want to do community about. It was very easy to understand during the sabbatical, because I just needed those people, and it was easy. Like, we all had the same needs. So I think I learned 2 things. One thing is the network that I had during the full-time job is not the network that helped me rebuild. That was a huge insight for so many reasons. As soon as I understood that, I reached out to new people. Some of it was cold calling, some of it was luck. But I guess I wanted to build a community, for example, of designers that I didn't have that much into my sphere, a community of fellow storytellers that did or didn't have an executive connection to a corporate job. It didn't matter. And I'm still building this with a pinch of salt, like literally picking people one by one. But I feel I also have this need of having a powerful message, connect people that I don't know. So I think that's what drove me to the idea of launching a podcast, for example.
Interesting. You make it sound so easy.
It's not at
Let's
all.
create a community and let's reach it. Yeah, is it?
It really isn't. It's like literally cherry picking people. I cannot say I have a community right now. I'm like still in the cherry picking
in the
stage.
Individuals, yeah.
Individuals, absolutely. What I think could help a community is when the community come together for a common need. So the idea of a podcast come also because this conversation that I started with the talk made me feel like there were other people that wanted to share their story or needed some advice or that were just interested in exploring the topic. And I think that idea of creating a community around this idea of how to find a place to call home or how to return to yourself or how to be in transition really is probably one of the ways in which I'm trying to build community. The rest is hard. Don't get me wrong. It's not easy because I also like having a creative life also means having a lot of solitary time.
Yeah. And especially now, I got together, I did a lot of the individual picking of individual designers that I think are going to be really cool for a community. And the most I could do because of Corona is get everybody on a Zoom, and it's not the same.
No, that put a stop on a lot of things.
Yeah, because you want to give them food and drink and get them talking to each other, and that's not happening on a Zoom.
I really miss the magic of the room. I really miss it.
Yeah. And so eventually we'll get back there. So tell us about this podcast, and I have one big question to wrap up, but tell us about this podcast and what your plans are for it and your hopes for it.
So the podcast is a platform and a community, but also a device in a way for provoking a change that I would like to see. So the podcast is about personal stories of transit. We say as told by the in-betweeners. What we mean by in-betweeners is people that are in between places, in between countries, in between cultures, in between languages, in between identities. It's an exploration about what it means to find a place to call home, and it's an exploration of how that search affects your identity and everything around you systemically and ecosystemically. I think I found the need of giving my contribute to this conversation around citizenship in a way is not so much a political agenda as it is a frustration with a narrative that I've seen too polarized around it. So if you think about citizenship, it's something that's given to you by law or by right. So what happens when citizenship is something that you earn by belonging and by your own experience of place? So what is that layer of significance and meaning that are not represented by institutions, that are not represented by media, that are not represented by whoever is interested in keeping this narrative polarized? In Italy, it's about the struggle of getting to the country or being an immigrant or being transferred, or it's the opposite side of the struggle is an absolutely story of success with no frills, with no dangers, with no problems, cleaned up of all the steps that make transitions meaningful, right? So in between these two narratives, what is the plethora of stories that are around there that we can hold space for and create a conversation about and enter with a point of view on cultural geography that is personal. Yeah. So that's the change that I would like to see in the world. And it's also like my main line of work, my main line of exploration. Like I've heard this incredible neuroscientist. She is an expert in AI. I don't remember the name right now, but she works with a lot of Silicon Valley corporations. And I've heard her say once at a conference in New York that when you choose a job, but in general, when you choose a realm in which you want to work, you better choose a problem that you're not able to solve, not even after you're dead, right? And for me, that problem is unpacking and understanding change and transition, and how do we create a home for ourselves? How do we belong? And I can do that indefinitely, and definitely it's a problem that will survive me. And also something that we're going to face more and more with everything that is ecosystemically happening to the planet as well.
Yeah, it seems like there's more and more, and there's going to be more and more refugees, immigrants, people who are just on the move.
Right.
People who don't know where their home is.
Right.
People who are from multiple places. and it seems to be a movement. I found gypsy punk rock as a way of dealing with this, and there's specifically a couple of groups that I don't know if you know Gogol Bordello.
Oh, absolutely love
Oh
them.
my God. So I've been to a show, and they sing to this problem. They sing about feeling like a foreigner in the US.
Right.
The song American Wedding, where it's like someone from Eastern Europe looking at an American wedding and it's, what is this?
Yeah.
And they sing about the immigrant story, and I mean, they're so powerful. And that helped me actually integrate my own feelings about being a foreigner in the States and coming back, but still half belonging
Right.
to the state. So the final big thing that I want to ask is about this journey of not just going home, or finding home, but becoming home.
Mm-hmm.
What does that mean to you to become home?
The first word that comes to mind when I think about becoming home is peace. I think becoming home yourself or inside yourself, it's one of the few ways left to not be at war. I understand it's very personal. Nothing is more political than the personal. And this idea of permanent ubiquity, it's not going to be an exception any longer. Mm-hmm. It's going to be a feature. It's going to be what the system is defined by, what the product of the system is defined by. And becoming home is why we're here. There's no other way for me to describe that. And not just because it's archetypically the end of every story, right? It's because it gives meaning to why we're traversing this planet. And it gives me that feeling that sometimes it's an illusion and sometimes it's something that I feel very deeply, of being at peace. It's a trigger for many positive changes that can happen by becoming home. I wonder what would happen if all of us would be interested in this process of becoming home. That's the question I ask myself every day. And I think that who knows what we could be if we could all become home.
Yeah. The word home is so powerful. And I think it can stand for so much, not just a place, but a state of being. Thank you so much for taking the time. You read this wonderful T.S. Eliot quote that I thought, if you want to read it.
All right. So this is a quote that my father actually always read to me, even when I was a child. And to me, it sounds like a prophecy, because it actually happened that I would leave this quote myself. The quote is, "We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all of our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time."
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Aaron. This was wonderful.
Thanks. And Donatella, where can people go find your stuff, your future podcast when it's up?
So the podcast is going to be at www.thedesignofreturn.com. As for myself, I don't have a digital home yet, because otherwise I wouldn't be an explorer of a place to find home. But you can definitely find me on Instagram at Donatella Caggiano whenever I'll be back to it. Or I'm a very huge fan of emails. So I like to have pen friends all over the world and be reached at via email personally. My email is donatellacaggiano@gmail.com. That's the fastest way to reach me. Or you can follow me on Medium, where I write from time to time.
Great. Thank you, Donatella.
Thank you, Aaron. It's been a real pleasure.
All right, that's it for today. If you enjoyed the podcast and would like to support it, please consider writing a 5-star review in Apple's podcast app or wherever you're listening. It helps many more people discover the podcast and also makes us feel good. Current support for the podcast comes from my own design company, Remake Labs. We run design sprints all over the world, and our goal is to improve outcomes, whether in business or various organizations, through repeated and rapid design interventions. Now, until next time, be well, everyone. See you next week on Remake.